obviously the situation in Syria is quite compelling and raises a lot of interesting questions that perhaps from one person's perspective who's sitting at home in a non-war-torn situation thinks like, well, that's really sad for them, but how does that impact me? But a lot of those technologies that they're using, I think, do have broader ramifications. So maybe that's something we need to take a second to discuss and maybe unpack a little bit.
Yeah, so on the one hand, for those, for example, that are familiar with the refugee crisis as it spilled out of Europe, right? So we're both American, as an example. A big part of the presidential debate from the last election revolved around Syrian refugees and other refugees. And so there was a lot of acrimony, maybe even some fear that was stoked about how do we know who these people are? Is it possible there's terrorists that are using this system to get into another country? And a lot of it boiled down to this idea of identity. So I think these questions very realistically do permeate borders. But I think to a point that you made earlier, it's not just that this is an isolated experience in Syria or as it impacts places outside of Syria, but more specifically that these types of technologies, the biometrics in particular, are really permeating both national and private ID systems for everyone across the globe, right? So, I mean, you've crossed a border recently, I'm sure. Like, are you seeing more and more biometrics being used at borders to kind of control who is coming in and who is coming out?
Well, yeah, sure. I think it's not just at the border, right? I mean, that's probably the situation, the context where we see it the most, where we're most cognizant of it. But you know, every day I see my students use biometrics when they log in to their computers or phones. Increasingly, biometrics as a component of identity will just increase over time, and how we want to employ that or how we want to control that will be important, because we've already moved just from fingerprint. Now we have, you know, many new technologies now do facial recognition too.
Yeah.
Right, and so the underlying technology of that is biometric by nature. And so how do we want to control that, particularly when that could lead to some unintended consequences with respect to who owns data, who's monitoring who's controlling that, how is that being stored, and kind of the questions that pop out when you open that box.
So some of you may have heard some stories relating to these types of biometric IDs, including using, say, Apple as an example, facial recognition software, et cetera. I think there's an interesting dichotomy. We talk about culture lag a lot. Some people are terrified of these new identification systems. They want to hold on to the passport. They want a physical representation. Other people are very, very quick to kind of shift over. They say they're more accurate or safer or whatever. One of the things that we saw with just using Apple as an example is that using facial recognition software, there was actually bias in the initial programs for that, where Asian faces, for example, were not identifiable. And so there was kind of this, you know, people with different faces could unlock somebody else's phone because the algorithm couldn't recognize their face as being separate, right? So there's the issue with bad data in gets a bad result. We know that. But then even if there's a small failure percentage, let's say just 1 or 2 or 3%, right? Among refugees in Syria, for example, that would have represented, you know, hundreds of thousands of people, or across the globe, it's the same thing. So if you have a bad password, you change the password, right? But if you have the fingerprint doesn't match up, like how do you go through and actually change that process? Like are we seeing within the financial industry or in terms of the technology, how are they addressing these types of very real kind of human or cultural challenges as these technologies are developing?
Yeah, I think part of, at least what I've seen and what I've experienced is, at least now, even with biometric data, and even with generally, statistically speaking, fairly low failure rates, relatively speaking, it's usually a combination, right? So there's biometric data plus something else that collectively creates your identity profile. I think that will continue to be the standard, so to speak, right now, as more and more companies and even governments and nation states employ this technology. The combination of it kind of creates a bit of redundancy, in just in case you do face those either technology-sided issues where the programming is a bit deficient or not up to spec yet, or in a situation where certain aspects of identity have changed, and we know certain aspects of biometric data can change, right? Fingerprints change, and things like that. And so the redundant aspect of having maybe multiple forms of identity on top of each other to create the full identity picture. I think that's probably going to be the approach that people take, and I think other forms of biometric data that get more and more advanced will also be employed as well.